Company's focused on repurposing a drug called exenatide, which was brought to market by AstraZeneca in 2005 for type 2 diabetes. And we're repurposing it for neurological indications, principally in diseases where you have raised intracranial pressure. The company has completed proof of concept both in vivo and in vitro, and all of that work's been published in peer-reviewed journals, things like Science Translational Medicine. The most important fact is that we have orphan drug designation for exenatide, which gives us a couple of important advantages in terms of the business model. So first of all, you get some, let's say, preferred advice with the regulators. So based on the Orphan Drug Act in Europe and the US, the regulators are trying to encourage people to develop drugs for rare indications. Orphan drug designation gives you, let's say, a preferred interaction with regulators. Secondly, the hurdle that you have to jump over to get to market is slightly lower than for a normal drug. So normally you would have to do a trial, a phase 3 study, and then a confirmatory study, submit that data to regulators. That's a very expensive and time-consuming process. For an orphan drug, you only have to do a single study, and that single study can be so-called phase 2 study. So the route to market is much quicker and more cost-effective. Once you get approval for your drug, the orphan drug designation gives you 10 years exclusivity on market. So you're able to market your drug in the defined indication for 10 years, which is a significant advantage for small indications. And because in IIH, which is our lead indication, there are no currently approved drugs. So we will be hopefully the first and the only approved medicine for IIH. So on IIH, we have a clinical study that's currently ongoing at Birmingham, a phase 2 study, which Alex will describe in more detail later. We expect to publish data, top-line data from that study towards the end of the first quarter next year. The last patient was enrolled in November this year. The key patent applications have been filed in the major geographies. The Japanese patent was granted last month, and the US and European patents are currently under examination. It's a fairly tight company. We don't have a lot of people at the moment. Myself as chair, Alex as CSO, David on the board, and then some financial representation. Maybe before I pass over to Alex, who'll introduce herself, I'll just maybe give you 2 minutes on my background. I grew up here in Sydney, but left in 1988 as a postdoctoral fellow at Oxford University. I then got into the venture capital space and worked for Nomura for 10 years. I ran their Europe and US business. All the venture capital investments, we made more than 30 investments into biotech companies in Europe and the US. Then I left, came on to the management side of the business. I've been CEO of 5 companies to date. All of those have been sold to large pharma over the past sort of 10 to 15 years. So with that, I'll just pass over to Alex, and she'll give a bit more information about herself and the science behind the company.
I'm Alex Sinclair, and I'm a practicing neurology consultant in the UK in Birmingham. And the other half of my week, I work as a clinician scientist. So I run a research group which has been running for at least 10 years plus, really looking for the causes and then therapeutic avenues for reducing intracranial pressure. I also look after the biggest patient clinic for idiopathic intracranial hypertension internationally, so we have a big clinical experience in understanding this patient group. And also out of the 5 clinical trials that have been run in this condition, we've run 4 of them out of Birmingham. So we've got a good idea about running the trials, picking the outcomes, and troubleshooting along the way. This year I've been voted onto the International Headache Society board from all around the globe. I also sit on the European Headache Federation board for headache. So this means I have a good ear to the ground in terms of what's moving in terms of research and also the political agenda for what's needed for new drugs coming through and new scientific discovery. Within the UK, I'm well represented on the British Association of the Study of Headache and the Association of British Neurologists. So I want to tell you first of all about idiopathic intracranial hypertension. It's probably a condition that most of you won't have heard of before today, unless I've already been meeting with you. But it's a condition that predominantly affects young women who have obesity. And for these women, they're really plagued by having prolonged chronic headaches. So if you can imagine any of you that have had a headache, if you can imagine having that headache every day for 10 years plus, 24/7, it's really very debilitating. This really impacts on their ability to work, ability to look after their children, and just take part in normal life. On top of that, the raised brain pressure that they have can cause damage to the optic nerve. That's the nerve at the back of the eye. And that means that up to 25% of them will get permanent severe visual failure. And so for a young cohort of women, this is a really big deal. One of the other really important factors about IIH, as I'm going to call it, is that it occurs mostly, 95%, in association with obesity. The age of incidence is predominantly between the ages of about 20 to 30, but that's the incident cases, and actually women have this condition for very much longer. So they may have the condition for 10 to 15 years in excess, so we see this right up to postmenopause. I want to talk a little bit more about how we can potentially alter brain pressure. So at the beginning, at the top, you can see in yellow, there's the factors of obesity, and then on the left, the female gender. And these are the factors which are driving and causing the IIH. But it's actually the bottom row that's the more important. So how can we manipulate and alter brain pressure? And what we're trying to do with the research program that we've been doing in Birmingham is to reduce the amount of brain fluid produced. This is called cerebrospinal fluid. It's a bit like turning off the tap. And by reducing brain fluid production, we reduce brain pressure. This is more detail about the incidence and prevalence of IIH. We've talked earlier today, Jason's been telling you that it's an orphan drug indication, so it is relatively rare. But actually, because this condition is driven by obesity, we're seeing the incidence going right up. Our data published in the last 12 months has shown that the incidence has increased by over 350% in the last 10 years. And with that, obviously, an increasing prevalence as well. And if you look at the data actually for the incidence linked to the BMI rate per country, it's very much higher. So in countries where you have high BMI, you have a much higher incidence of IIH. How do we know the patients have IIH? It's actually a very stepwise, straightforward diagnosis. The patients, these young women, they typically present to their optician or the family doctor or to the emergency room. And they go because they have headaches and altered vision. And at that point, the first thing that's usually done is a history and an examination. And when the doctor looks in their eye, they'll see this very characteristic feature called papilledema, which is the swelling of the nerve at the back of the eye, which indicates raised brain pressure. And from then, we go on to do imaging of the brain, usually an MRI scan, which will not show a brain tumor, not show a brain bleed. It's usually normal. And from there, we go on to do a lumbar puncture, and we see that they have high brain pressure. So these three simple steps, the examination, the scan, and then the lumbar puncture, lead us to that accurate diagnosis of IIH. And that's really where we then start to have the problem as a doctor, because we don't have an effective drug to treat this condition. In terms of how we treat the conditions, well, we're really at the forefront of trying to streamline the international care for these patients. So last year I published the first international consensus guideline on how we manage and treat idiopathic intracranial hypertension, and again, a key document for the European Headache Federation. But these documents do have to highlight that we don't have a wealth of effective drugs. So what drug options are available? Well, the drug options that we have are unapproved and they're not licensed. They work poorly, and the other problem is they have high side effect profiles. The most common drug is the one at the top of the list, that's acetazolamide, and that's used by quite a few patients, but the trouble with it is that the efficacy is low and it causes a high side effect profile. It causes tingling in the mouth, unpleasant taste, nausea, vomiting, and depression. So when we ran a study on this drug a number of years ago, we found that 48% of patients couldn't continue to take it, so it's a really unpopular drug. And it's just to note the date at the top there, that was 1954, and we've had nothing else come through in that space of managing raised brain pressure since that time. The other drugs below are used in a very minority of patients, and again, have very sketchy evidence and very sketchy efficacy. We've put the pie chart up to emphasize that actually the vast majority of the patients in blue, 93%, will require tablet management, medical management. But there are patients that need further intervention. So if brain pressure is really high and vision starts to become affected, there is a risk of blindness, a real risk of blindness, up to 25%. So to mitigate for that risk, some patients have to go for neurosurgery, and it's really invasive. So they need to have a shunt procedure, which is essentially a tube, which is put from the center of the brain to drain the fluid, and it then plugs into the belly cavity to drain the fluid. And that does work. It does rapidly reduce the brain pressure and save vision, but it's a very short-term fix and is problematic. 50% block or need altering within a year, high risk of meningitis, infection, shunt dislocation. So it's a saving of the site procedure, but really what we want to be doing is avoiding doing these procedures by having better medical therapy. So what's our approach? So what my lab has been working through in the last number of years is the basic science and the discovery science to show that exenatide, which is a small peptide, can reduce brain pressure. This is a GLP-1 receptor agonist, and what we've shown is that the target tissue, which is the secretory structure within the brain that produces brain fluid, has the signaling capability to use GLP-1 receptor agonists to reduce brain fluid production. And we've mapped out the signaling pathway. And then probably one of our real highlights in the lab was to show in our animal models with raised brain pressure that we could dramatically reduce brain pressure by 45%. And we've compared that to the other drugs that I showed you earlier, and it's far in excess. So that was really exciting for us. And then we went on to look at how the drug could be used chronically and how the pharmacokinetics and the pharmacodynamics work. Where does exenatide come from? Well, this is something I usually enjoy telling my kids about. So what am I working on? Well, actually, this exenatide peptide sequence was originally found in the saliva of the Gila lizard, which lives in the Arizona desert. But of course, we're not going to be using the Arizona desert lizard for our manufacture. This is a peptide that can be manufactured in a core facility. So this is an important slide because this is now showing you how we've moved away from our early laboratory studies now, and we're actually using this drug in our patients. So this is our first trial to show proof of concept. It's a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, but we're doing this in a really innovative way. These patients, and I don't know if I can highlight it on here, have got a brain monitor. Can you see that? So this is a little monitor in the brain. It's about the size of a 50p coin, or a 20 cents piece, Jason tells me. And this monitor enables us to have beat-to-beat changes in intracranial pressure. So we can test this drug and check very rapidly how brain pressure is being altered, and then we've dosed them for 3 months to check how the brain pressure will be altered after 3 months. And of course, we're going to look at some other outcome measures, such as headache and vision and quality of life. So this trial, we've had 10 patients complete. Our last 6 patients have finished recruiting, and as Jason is saying, these results will be due in the early part of next year, first quarter. So the Invex proprietary patent ICP blocker, this is based on the drug Byetta, which was originally used for diabetes. This was an AstraZeneca drug. It's now off patent, but the good thing about that is that we know that it's safe and well tolerated. It's been used in hundreds of thousands of people around the US and around the world. So this is a really well-known drug. We've been using it subcut, as you do in diabetes, at a twice-daily dose. But actually, our knowledge and our science has shown us really that intracranial pressure changes in a particular pattern over 24 hours. So we're going to be altering the formulation of exenatide so that it fits precisely the changes in brain pressure. So we'll be reformulating to make a drug that's very specific for brain pressure. So the pressure blocker will be proprietary and patented. We will aim, and we will be the first drug to come to market for IIH, pending the trial. We will be going through the approval processes, which we're working through now with the FDA and the European Medicines Agency to agree our outcome measures for our trial in order for that to be a licensing market authorization trial. And we've mentioned earlier that we won't need to go on to do phase 3 trials because this is an orphan drug indication, so one phase 2 study will be enough for us. And pending the results of the trial, we will then go on to get national drug codes to enable prescribing in the US, for example, and across Europe. Because we'll be the first drug to market for IIH, we'll have that first mover advantage, and anything in the future will then need to be compared against our drug, which will be good. But actually, most importantly, our drug formulation will be unique. So the ICP pressure blocker will not be the same as the Byetta used for diabetes, and hence there cannot be substitution. So what about the repurposing business model? Well, it's a model that's been successfully used in a number of medical indications. So you can see the list here. There's quite a few drugs which have been used for one indication, been found to be safe and tolerated, and then you find there's another indication for that drug. And particularly when it's an orphan indication, it means you can move rapidly through the processes into market authorization. So Jason, I'm going to hand back to you to give our goals for next year.
The one thing we want to cover here at the end is just to sort of say how can we create value for shareholders over the next sort of 12 to 18 months. And I think we have 5 core goals that we want to achieve over the next period of time. The first is to complete the reformulation of exenatide. So this has been ongoing now for quite some time. We're moving, I think, fairly rapidly, and we expect to conclude that certainly in the first quarter of 2020, so that we'll have a drug ready for the registration study, which we hope to start next year. Obviously, we're not going to establish manufacturing ourselves. Exenatide is an existing drug. There are quite a number of manufacturers of peptides like exenatide, so we can outsource this quite effectively. All of the excipients and the way that we'll deliver the drug for IIH are already established, well used, and approved by regulators, so we see no additional hurdles from the delivery of the drug. But this will all be outsourced rather than as a sort of core competence of the company. Obviously, the phase 2 study will complete that now that the last patient is enrolled, and as Alex has said, we expect data from that in the top line, at least in the end of the first quarter 2020. So there we will have established for the first time in patients the ability of exenatide to reduce intracranial pressure. Obviously, we are already in discussion with regulators. As an orphan drug, it's important to interact with these groups to really define the design of the study and of the endpoints such that we can get an approval and have both the US and Europe on the same page in terms of what is required to get approval for the drug. And then finally, the goal here will also be to start at least one and possibly two additional proof of concept studies in some of the other indications. So whereas IIH we think is still a fairly substantial commercial opportunity, there are clearly a lot of other neurological indications that are significantly larger, like traumatic brain injury, for example, stroke. These represent very significant markets where we would seek additional formulations and additional patents to cover these spaces. Finally, on a sort of slightly lighter note, Alex was approached earlier this year by NASA. So they're interested in going to Mars, and one of the problems with extended space flight is raised intracranial pressure. At the moment, they have no solutions to this, and they've been talking to Alex and her group at Birmingham, and there is the potential to maybe do a trial in these astronauts over the next coming years. With that, I think we'll finish the formal presentation.